Sarah Mitchell had it all figured out at 28. A successful marketing executive in downtown Chicago. She lived in a sleek high-rise apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, drove a BMW that she'd worked 3 years to afford, and had just got engaged to David, a promising lawyer from a respected family. Her Instagram feed was a carefully curated showcase of brunch dates, weekend getaways, and professional achievements. To her 50,000 followers, Sarah embodied the American dream, young, successful, and seemingly untouchable. But success had come at a price that Sarah rarely acknowledged, even to herself. She hadn't spoken to her family in over 2 years, not since the explosive argument that had torn apart what remained of the Mitchell clan. Her parents had divorced when she was 16, and the bitter custody battle had left everyone wounded. Her mother, Linda, had retreated into alcoholism and a series of failed relationships. Her father, Robert, had remarried quickly to a woman barely 10 years older than Sarah, then moved to a small town in Oregon to start over. Sarah's younger brother, Jake, had bounced between homes, eventually dropping out of college and disappearing into the underground music scene in Portland. The family fracture had been complete when Sarah refused to attend her father's second wedding, claiming work commitments, but really unable to stomach watching him play happy family with someone else. The last conversation she'd had with any of them was a screaming match with Jake over the phone, where he'd accused her of being a selfish, money-obsessed stranger who had forgotten where she came from. She'd hung up and blocked his number, telling herself she was better off without the drama and dysfunction. So when the call came on a Tuesday morning in November, Sarah almost didn't answer the unknown Oregon number. She was in the middle of a crucial presentation prep, her phone buzzing insistently on her glass desk as she reviewed market analytics. Something made her pick up, maybe intuition, maybe just annoyance at the persistence. The voice on the other end belonged to Margaret Walsh, a lawyer from the small town of Cedar Falls, Oregon. Her tone was professional but gentle as she delivered news that would shatter Sarah's carefully constructed world. Robert Mitchell, age 54, had died suddenly of a heart attack 3 days ago. He'd been found in his workshop behind the house, apparently having collapsed while working on one of his woodworking projects. The funeral had already happened, a small, quiet affair that Sarah had missed entirely. But that wasn't the most shocking part. According to Margaret, Robert had left behind a will that defied everyone's expectations. Instead of leaving his estate to his young wife Melissa, he had bequeathed everything to his estranged children, Sarah and Jake. The inheritance included not just money, but something far more intriguing, a sprawling property on the outskirts of Cedar Falls that Robert had purchased quietly just 6 months before his death. The property came with a significant mystery. Robert had spent his final months renovating an old barn on the land, working alone and telling no one, not even Melissa, what he was building. Margaret explained that the will contained an unusual stipulation. Both Sarah and Jake had to come to Cedar Falls within 30 days to claim their inheritance together. If either refused or failed to appear, the entire estate would go to charity. There was no way to claim it separately or send representatives. Robert had been very specific about requiring both children to appear in person and sign the documents together. The inheritance was substantial enough to be life-changing. Robert had been more successful than anyone realized, having sold his construction business for a significant sum just before his death. Combined with life insurance and the mysterious property, the total value exceeded $2 million. For Sarah, who despite her apparent success was actually drowning in student loans, credit card debt, and the crushing expenses of maintaining her lifestyle, the money represented freedom. For Jake, who had been struggling to make ends meet as a musician, it could mean the difference between a future and continued uncertainty. But claiming it meant confronting the family demons she'd spent years avoiding. It meant seeing Jake again, dealing with the guilt over missing her father's funeral, and facing the reality that Robert had thought about his children even after years of silence. Most challenging of all, It meant putting her carefully orchestrated life on hold and traveling to a small town that represented everything she'd worked to escape. David's reaction when she told him was predictably practical. He saw only the financial opportunity, encouraging her to take time off work and handle the inheritance quickly and efficiently. He offered to come with her, already talking about how they could invest the money and accelerate their wedding plans. But something in his eager calculating bothered Sarah, though she couldn't put her finger on exactly what. Her boss at the marketing firm was less understanding, taking time off during their busiest season for what he saw as family drama could impact her trajectory toward the promotion she'd been chasing. The subtle implication was clear: choose between family obligations and career advancement. As Sarah sat in her apartment that night, looking out at the city lights that had once seemed like stars to reach for, she felt the weight of a decision that would define not just her financial future, but who she was willing to be. The successful urban professional who had moved beyond her messy small-town origins, or the daughter who owed her father's memory more than years of silence and resentment. The train ticket to Oregon sat on her kitchen counter, purchased in a moment of impulse, but not yet confirmed. She had Jake's number, found through mutual acquaintances, but hadn't called him yet. The conversation would be awkward at best, hostile at worst. But without both of them there, neither would get anything. As she finally dialed his number, Sarah realized that Robert's final act hadn't just been about money. It had been about forcing his children to face each other and perhaps find their way back to being a family. Whether that would be a gift or a curse remained to be seen. The bus ride from Portland to Cedar Falls took Jake Mitchell through landscapes that reminded him why he tried so hard to make in the city. Rolling hills gave way to small farming communities, each one looking more economically depressed than the last. At 25, Jake had inherited his father's height and broad shoulders, but none of his practical skills. Instead, he'd thrown himself into music, believing that talent and passion would be enough to break through in Portland's competitive scene. Reality had been less kind. His band, Broken Frequencies, had shown promise but never quite achieved the breakthrough they needed. They played small venues, built a modest local following, and scraped by on a combination of gig money, part-time jobs, and the occasional couch to crash on. Jake had been living in a converted garage behind his bandmate's house, paying minimal rent in exchange for help with home repairs he was terrible at completing. The call from Sarah had been surreal. Her voice sounded different, more polished, more careful, but underneath the professional veneer, he could hear the same uncertainty that had always been there when their family was falling apart. The conversation had been brief and awkward, focused on logistics rather than the fact that they were both orphans now. They'd agreed to meet at the lawyer's office, claim the inheritance, and get back to their separate lives as quickly as possible. But as the bus pulled into Cedar Falls' small downtown, Jake felt the familiar weight of returning to places that held too many memories. He'd been here only once before, about 3 years ago, when Robert had first moved to town with Melissa. The visit had been a disaster. Jake uncomfortable in the domestic stability his father seemed to have found, Robert trying too hard to play the role of wise patriarch, and Melissa hovering awkwardly on the periphery of a relationship she didn't understand. The town itself was exactly what Jake had expected. One main street with a few local businesses struggling to compete with chain stores on the highway, a small diner that looked unchanged since the 1980s, and the kind of quiet that city dwellers find either peaceful or suffocating. He spotted Sarah immediately outside the lawyer's office, checking her phone with the impatient energy he remembered from their childhood. She looked every inch the successful professional in her tailored coat and leather boots, her dark hair styled in the kind of precise way that spoke of expensive salons and careful maintenance. Their greeting was polite but distant, like former acquaintances rather than siblings who had once been inseparable. Sarah looked Jake over with barely concealed disapproval. His worn jeans, scuffed boots, and the kind of vintage jacket that looked deliberately casual, but had actually been necessitated by budget constraints. He noticed she'd lost weight since he'd last seen her, her face more angular and defined, her smile more practiced than genuine. Margaret Walsh turned out to be a woman in her 60s with the kind of practical kindness that small-town lawyers develop over decades of handling family crises. Her office was exactly what they'd expected, with paneling, family photos, and shelves lined with legal volumes that looked like they'd been consulted regularly. She guided them through the basic details of the will with professional efficiency. But Jake could sense there was more to the story than simple inheritance logistics. The numbers were staggering. Jake had never imagined his father had accumulated so much wealth, especially after the divorce had seemingly left him starting over. The construction business sale alone had netted over $1 million, and Robert had invested wisely in the years since. But the real mystery was the property. 47 acres of rolling hills and forest, purchased for cash just months before Robert's death, along with the renovated barn that no one had seen the inside of. Margaret explained that Robert had been secretive about his project, working on the barn himself and refusing help from local contractors. Melissa had complained about his long hours there, but he'd brushed off her questions, saying it was just a hobby to keep his hands busy in retirement. The property had its own private road and was isolated enough that curious neighbors couldn't see what he was doing. What made the inheritance even more intriguing was Robert's specific instructions about the property. Sarah and Jake were required to spend at least one full day there together before they could finalize the inheritance. They had to visit the barn, go through any materials Robert had left, and sign documents certifying they'd completed this requirement. Only then could they decide how to divide the assets and go their separate ways. The requirement felt manipulative to both siblings, but the money was too significant to walk away from. They agreed to drive out to the property the next morning, though Sarah made it clear she wanted to complete the obligation as quickly as possible and return to Chicago by the weekend. They spent that evening in Cedar Falls' only decent motel, occupying separate rooms and avoiding each other at dinner. Jake ate at the diner counter, listening to locals discuss weather and local politics, while Sarah worked on her laptop in her room, trying to stay connected to the professional world she'd temporarily left behind. Both were processing their father's death in private, neither ready to share grief with someone who had become essentially a stranger. But late that night, Jake found himself knocking on Sarah's door. She answered in hotel pajamas, her professional mask slipped enough to show the exhaustion underneath. For the first time since they'd been reunited, they had a real conversation, not about money or logistics, but about the strange reality of being the only two people left who remembered their family when it had been whole. They talked about childhood memories that felt both distant and immediate. Summer camping trips before the divorce, Robert teaching them to identify birds and trees, the way he'd made elaborate pancake breakfasts on weekends. They carefully avoided discussing the years of estrangement, but both felt the weight of time lost and words that could never be taken back. As the conversation wound down, Sarah mentioned something that had been bothering her since the lawyers' meeting. Robert's secretiveness about the barn project wasn't like him. He'd always been someone who enjoyed sharing his work, explaining his plans, involving others in his projects. The fact that he'd worked alone and kept the purpose hidden suggested this wasn't just a casual retirement hobby. Jake had been thinking the same thing. Their father had been many things, stubborn, sometimes distant, prone to grand gestures, but never secretive without reason. Whatever he'd built in that barn had been important enough to reshape his will around, significant enough to force his estranged children back together. As they said goodnight, both siblings carried the same unspoken question. What had Robert been building? And why had it been important enough to risk his entire estate on the chance that his children would claim it together? The next morning would bring answers, but neither Sarah nor Jake could have imagined how those answers would challenge everything they thought they knew about their father, their family, and themselves. The drive to Robert's property took them through increasingly remote countryside, past farms and forests that seemed untouched by modern development. Sarah followed the GPS directions while Jake sat in the passenger seat of her rental car, both of them quiet with anticipation. The private road that led to the property was well maintained but unmarked, winding through dense trees that created a natural privacy barrier. When they finally emerged into the clearing where Robert had built his final project, both siblings were struck by the scope of what their father had accomplished. The property was more beautiful than they'd expected. Rolling meadows surrounded by forest, with a small creek running along the eastern boundary. The original farmhouse was modest but well-maintained, clearly where Robert and Melissa had lived during his final months. But it was the barn that commanded attention. From the outside, it looked like a traditional agricultural building, albeit larger and more carefully constructed than most. The red paint was fresh, the metal roof new, and the foundation more substantial than necessary for storing hay or farm equipment. But there were subtle anomalies, electrical lines that seemed too heavy for simple lighting, ventilation systems that appeared more sophisticated than barn storage would require, and windows positioned in ways that suggested interior spaces designed for human occupancy rather than animals or equipment. Margaret had given them keys and the alarm code, along with specific instructions to document their visit with photos that would be required for the inheritance paperwork. As they approached the main entrance, both Sarah and Jake felt the strange sensation of walking into a mystery their father had crafted specifically for them. The interior took their breath away. Robert hadn't built a barn at all. He'd created something entirely unexpected. The main floor had been converted into a combination workshop, library, and memorial space that told the story of their family in ways neither sibling had ever seen before. The walls were lined with carefully organized photo albums, framed pictures, and memorabilia from every stage of their lives, not just the happy years before the divorce, but everything that came after. There were photos of Sarah's college graduation that Robert somehow had copies of, despite not being invited. Pictures of Jake's band performances that he'd never known his father had attended. Newspaper clippings about Sarah's professional achievements, demo recordings of Jake's music, even printouts of social media posts that showed Robert had been quietly following their lives from a distance for years. But the photos were just the beginning. Robert had created detailed timelines of both children's lives, tracking their accomplishments, struggles, and major life events with the dedication of a devoted biographer. He'd kept copies of every letter they'd written as children, every school project, every report card. There were boxes of items they'd left behind after the divorce, childhood toys, books, clothing they'd outgrown, all carefully preserved as if he'd been maintaining a museum of their shared history. The workshop area revealed another side of Robert's final project. He'd been building furniture, not simple carpentry projects, but elaborate, beautiful pieces clearly designed for specific purposes. A desk perfectly sized for Sarah's height and work habits, with built-in organizers that reflected her obsessive need for order. A guitar stand and recording setup tailored to Jake's musical equipment, with acoustic design elements that would enhance sound quality in small spaces. In the center of the space was a large table where Robert had been working on his final project, a detailed scale model of the house where they'd lived as a family before the divorce. Every room was recreated with meticulous accuracy, down to the furniture arrangements and the colors Sarah remembered from her childhood bedroom. It was as if Robert had been trying to physically reconstruct the life they'd lost, to build a tangible reminder of when they'd been whole. But it was the discovery of Robert's journals that truly revealed the depth of his hidden project. Stacked neatly on shelves throughout the barn were dozens of notebooks where he'd recorded his thoughts, observations, and plans over the final months of his life. The entries revealed a man consumed not with self-pity or regret, but with desperate love for children he'd lost and determination to find a way back to them. The journals chronicled Robert's growing awareness that his heart condition was more serious than he'd let anyone know. Rather than seeking aggressive treatment that might buy him a few more years, he'd chosen to spend his remaining time creating something that would outlast him. A comprehensive record of his love for his children and a plan to bring them back together after his death. Entry after entry revealed the careful thought behind every aspect of his final months. He'd sold his business not just for financial security, but to have resources for his project. He'd purchased the isolated property to work without interference or well-meaning advice. He'd spent weeks researching Sarah's career and Jake's music, learning about their adult lives in ways that direct communication had made impossible. Most heartbreaking were the entries where Robert wrote directly to his children, knowing they would read his words only after he was gone. He apologized for the ways the divorce had damaged their family, acknowledged his mistakes in handling the aftermath, and expressed regret for letting pride and stubbornness keep him from reaching out during the years of estrangement. But he also wrote about his continued pride in their achievements, his understanding of why they needed to distance themselves, and his hope that they might find their way back to each other. The final section of The Barn revealed Robert's ultimate purpose. He'd created a comprehensive plan for Sarah and Jake to rebuild their relationship, complete with suggested activities, conversation topics, and ways to address the hurt and resentment that had driven them apart. There were sealed envelopes marked for different stages of their reconciliation, family recipes he wanted them to cook together, and even a detailed family tree that included research into relatives they'd never known about. But perhaps most surprising was Robert's analysis of his children's adult lives. His journals revealed insights that were both uncomfortable and accurate. Sarah's apparent success masking financial stress and emotional isolation, Jake's artistic pursuits hiding fears about his future and self-worth. Robert had seen through the facades they'd built and understood the ways their childhood trauma had shaped their adult choices. As Sarah and Jake spent hours going through their father's final gift, they began to see each other through Robert's eyes, not as the estranged siblings they'd become, but as wounded people who had responded to family trauma in different but understandable ways. Sarah's drive for financial security and professional success made sense as a response to the chaos of their parents' divorce. Jake's rejection of conventional stability was equally logical as a reaction to watching supposed adult security crumble. The barn also contained practical elements that revealed Robert's continued care for their futures. There were detailed financial records showing exactly how he'd accumulated his wealth, investment advice tailored to each of their personalities and goals, and even contacts for therapists and counselors who specialized in helping adults repair family relationships. By late afternoon, both siblings were emotionally exhausted but fundamentally changed by what they discovered. The man they'd seen as distant and uncaring had actually been desperately involved in their lives, just from a distance that respect for their autonomy had required. His final act wasn't manipulation, but love, a carefully crafted bridge back to each other and to the family connection they'd lost. As they prepared to leave the barn, Sarah noticed one final detail that brought tears to her eyes. On Robert's workshop bench was an unfinished project, a picture frame clearly intended to hold a photo of all three of them together. The frame was nearly complete, needing only final assembly and finishing touches. Next to it was a note in Robert's handwriting. "For the photo we'll take when you come home." The drive back to town was silent, both Sarah and Jake processing what they discovered in ways that felt too big for conversation. The image of their father working alone in that barn, creating a monument to his love for them while his heart literally failed, had shattered assumptions they'd carried for years. But along with the emotional revelation came practical questions that were even more disturbing. Back at the motel, they finally began to talk through the implications of what they'd found. Sarah, with her business background, was the first to voice what they were both thinking. The timeline didn't make sense. According to the medical records Margaret had shown them, Robert's heart attack had been sudden and unexpected. But his journals revealed he'd known for months that his condition was deteriorating. He'd written extensively about symptoms he was experiencing, medication he was avoiding, and his conscious choice to focus on his barn project rather than seeking aggressive treatment. Jake raised an even more troubling question. If Robert had known he was dying and had gone to such elaborate lengths to document his love for his children, why hadn't he simply reached out directly? Why create this complex, posthumous reconciliation plan instead of picking up the phone and trying to repair their relationships while he was still alive? The answer came from an unexpected source. That evening, Melissa appeared at their motel, drawn by news of their arrival that had spread through Cedar Falls' small-town network. Robert's widow was younger than both siblings had remembered, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested someone carrying a burden too heavy for her years. Melissa's story filled in crucial gaps that Robert's journals had left unclear. She revealed that Robert had tried repeatedly to reconnect with his children during his final year, but his attempts had been blocked in ways that neither Sarah nor Jake had known about. phone calls that went to disconnected numbers because they changed their contact information without telling family, letters sent to old addresses that were returned unopened, social media messages that were filtered into spam folders or blocked by privacy settings they'd forgotten they'd activated. But more disturbing was Melissa's revelation about the insurance investigation that had followed Robert's death. The insurance company had questioned whether Robert's death was truly accidental, given evidence that he'd known about his heart condition and had made significant financial changes in the months before his death. They'd ultimately paid the claim, but only after determining that while Robert had made risky choices about his medical care, he hadn't technically committed suicide. Melissa also revealed something that changed everything. Robert hadn't just been building the barn as a memorial. He'd been planning to invite Sarah and Jake to visit, to show them what he'd created and use it as a starting point for rebuilding their relationships. The inheritance structure was his backup plan, implemented only because he'd run out of time before completing his primary goal of direct reconciliation. The most shocking revelation came when Melissa showed them Robert's real medical records, documents that revealed his heart condition had been far more serious than anyone had realized. He'd been advised months earlier that he needed immediate surgery with only a moderate chance of success. Instead of telling Melissa or his children about the severity of his condition, he'd chosen to spend what he knew might be his final months creating something lasting rather than fighting for more time that might be painful and futile. But Melissa's story also revealed Robert's final plan, one that his sudden death had prevented him from implementing. Hidden in his personal effects were airplane tickets to Chicago and Portland, along with detailed itineraries for surprise visits to both of his children. He'd planned to show up unannounced at Sarah's office and Jake's last known address, hoping that shock and curiosity would get him past their defenses long enough to start healing conversations. The tickets were dated for the week after his death, suggesting that Robert had been planning his reconciliation visits when his heart finally gave out. The irony was devastating. He died believing his children were too angry to see him, while they'd been living with the assumption that he'd chosen his new life over any relationship with them. As the full scope of Robert's final months became clear, both Sarah and Jake were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their own choices. Sarah realized that her financial stress and professional obsession had been driving her toward exactly the kind of isolation that had defined Robert's final years. Jake saw parallels between his father's struggle to connect across emotional distance and his own difficulties maintaining relationships with bandmates, friends, and potential romantic partners. But the most disturbing revelation was still to come. Late that night, Margaret Walsh called with news that would transform their understanding of everything they discovered. The insurance company's investigation had uncovered something that local authorities had missed. Robert's death might not have been as natural as everyone had assumed. The autopsy had revealed levels of medication in Robert's system that were inconsistent with his prescribed dosages. While the amounts weren't lethal, they suggested that someone had been altering his medication in ways that would have worsened his heart condition. The insurance company had initially suspected suicide, but further investigation pointed toward something more sinister: the possibility that Robert had been deliberately poisoned. The investigation had focused on Melissa as the most likely suspect, given her access to Robert's medication and her potential financial motive. But the evidence was inconclusive, and the case had been quietly closed due to lack of definitive proof. The insurance company had paid the claim to avoid a lengthy legal battle, but they'd made it clear that questions remained about the circumstances of Robert's death. Margaret revealed that she'd been hesitant to share this information with Sarah and Jake because she wasn't certain they needed to know about the investigation. But the more she thought about Robert's final months and the elaborate lengths he'd gone to in creating his barn memorial, the more she'd wondered if his secretiveness had been motivated by more than just emotional preparation for reconciliation with his children. The possibility that Robert had been murdered cast everything they discovered in a new light. His isolation while working on the barn project, his secretiveness about his plans, his decision to change his will without telling Melissa. All of these choices made more sense if he'd suspected someone was trying to harm him. The barn wasn't just a monument to his love for his children. It might have been his attempt to preserve evidence and ensure that his story would be told if something happened to him. As Sarah and Jake absorbed this final revelation, they realized that claiming their inheritance was no longer just about money or family reconciliation. They were potentially the only people positioned to discover the truth about their father's death and ensure that justice was served if he had indeed been murdered. The decision to investigate further would mean extending their stay in Cedar Falls, putting their separate lives on hold, and working together in ways they hadn't done since childhood. But walking away would mean potentially letting their father's killer go free and abandoning the final gift he tried to give them, not just financial security, but the chance to become a family again. The decision to investigate their father's death changed everything between Sarah and Jake. For the first time since childhood, they had a shared purpose that transcended their individual grievances and forced them to work as a team. Sarah's analytical skills and professional connections proved valuable in understanding the financial and legal aspects of the case, while Jake's intuitive approach and ability to connect with people opened doors that formal investigation might have missed. Their first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jake had been spending time at the local diner, using his musician skills at reading people and building rapport to learn about Robert's final months from a community perspective. The picture that emerged was troubling. Robert had become increasingly paranoid and isolated in his final weeks, behavior that locals had attributed to grief over his estrangement from his children, but which now seemed potentially connected to genuine threats. Several people mentioned that Robert had seemed particularly wary around Melissa, despite their apparent marital harmony. The diner owner recalled Robert asking strange questions about whether certain medications could be detected in routine blood tests, conversations that had seemed odd at the time but now appeared ominous. Most significantly, Jake learned that Robert had confided in at least one person about his concerns: Dr. Patricia Evans, the local physician who had been treating his heart condition. Dr. Evans initially refused to discuss Robert's case, citing patient confidentiality, but Sarah's persistence and legal research revealed that certain protections were waived when investigating potential crimes. When they finally met with her, the doctor's story provided crucial missing pieces. Robert had indeed suspected that someone was tampering with his medication, but he'd been reluctant to make formal accusations without proof. Instead, he'd been secretly adjusting his own dosages and keeping detailed records of his symptoms, trying to determine if his suspicions were justified. The doctor had advised Robert to report his concerns to the police, but he'd refused, saying he needed more evidence before destroying someone's life with unfounded accusations. Dr. Evans had been troubled enough by Robert's fears that she'd increased the frequency of his appointments and had been planning to suggest he separate from Melissa temporarily when he died suddenly. But the most damning evidence came from Robert's barn itself. Hidden behind the sentimental memorial were carefully organized files that revealed Robert had been conducting his own investigation. He'd been photographing his medication bottles daily, documenting changes in pill counts and appearances that suggested tampering. He'd kept detailed logs of his symptoms, noting correlations between feeling particularly unwell and specific dates that aligned with Melissa's access to his medication. Most importantly, Robert had set up a hidden camera system in their bedroom, initially to monitor his sleep patterns as part of his health tracking, but which had inadvertently captured footage of Melissa tampering with his medication bottles. The video files, stored on encrypted drives hidden throughout the barn, provided clear evidence of systematic poisoning over several months. The footage was devastating to watch. It showed Melissa carefully opening Robert's medication bottles, replacing some pills with look-alike substances, and altering dosages in ways that would worsen his heart condition without immediately causing death. The systematic nature of her actions, combined with her careful research into which medications to target, revealed a calculated murder plot designed to appear like natural death from a known medical condition. But understanding Melissa's motive required deeper investigation into Robert's finances and their relationship. Sarah's business background proved crucial in unraveling the financial complexity that had motivated the murder. Robert's wealth was larger than anyone had realized, and his marriage to Melissa had been legally structured in ways that would have left her with very little if they divorced. However, as his widow, She would have inherited everything if not for the will that left his estate to his children. The timeline revealed that Robert had changed his will only after becoming suspicious about his medication, suggesting he'd been protecting his estate from someone he suspected was trying to kill him. Melissa's motive became clear. She'd assumed she was the primary beneficiary and had been slowly poisoning Robert to inherit his wealth before he could discover her deception or change his legal arrangements. But Melissa had made one crucial mistake. In her focus on Robert's heart medication, she'd overlooked his careful documentation habits and his technological sophistication. The same attention to detail that had allowed him to create the elaborate barn memorial had also enabled him to collect evidence of her crimes. His secretiveness about the barn project hadn't been about surprising his children. It had been about building a safe space to investigate his suspicions and preserve evidence. When Sarah and Jake presented their findings to local law enforcement, the case moved quickly. The video evidence was unambiguous, the financial motive was clear, and Melissa's access and opportunity were undeniable. She was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, her careful poisoning plan undone by the very thoroughness that had made Robert such a devoted father. The trial revealed additional disturbing details about Melissa's background. She had a history of targeting older men with significant assets, forming relationships that ended in their suspicious deaths or mysterious illnesses that transferred wealth to her. Robert had been her most ambitious target, but also the one who had been careful enough to document her crimes. But the resolution of their father's murder was only part of the transformation that Sarah and Jake experienced during their extended stay in Cedar Falls. Working together to seek justice for Robert had forced them to confront their own relationship and the ways their childhood trauma had shaped their adult choices. Sarah began to understand that her relentless pursuit of professional success had been motivated by fear of the financial instability and emotional chaos that had defined her adolescence after her parents' divorce. Her perfectionist tendencies and relationship difficulties were survival strategies that had outlived their usefulness, leaving her isolated and exhausted despite apparent success. Jake recognized that his rejection of conventional stability had been equally driven by trauma, a response to watching his family's supposed security collapse into bitter conflict. His struggle to commit to relationships or long-term goals was rooted in the same fear that motivated Sarah's overachievement, the terror of building something that could be destroyed by forces beyond his control. Their father's barn memorial became a catalyst for healing conversations they'd avoided for years. Using Robert's journals as a guide, they began to address the hurt and resentment that had driven them apart, acknowledging their individual roles in the family's breakdown while also recognizing the ways they'd both been victims of circumstances beyond their control. The inheritance, when they finally claimed it, became less important than the relationship they'd rebuilt. Sarah used her portion to pay off her debts and take a sabbatical from her high-pressure job, spending time in therapy to address the anxiety and perfectionism that had been consuming her life. Jake invested in a small recording studio in Portland, finally committed to building something lasting rather than just surviving from gig to gig. But perhaps most importantly, they decided to maintain the barn as Robert had envisioned it, not just as a memorial to their family's history, but as a retreat where they could continue the healing work he'd started. They established a foundation in Robert's memory to help other families navigate divorce and estrangement, using the resources he'd left them to extend his final gift of reconciliation to others who needed it. The property in Cedar Falls became a regular gathering place for Sarah and Jake, who discovered that they genuinely enjoyed each other's company when they weren't carrying the weight of childhood grievances. Sarah's organizational skills and Jake's creativity complemented each other in ways that reminded them why they'd been close as children, before trauma and misunderstanding had driven them apart. On the anniversary of Robert's death, they completed his final woodworking project, the picture frame he'd been building for a family photo. The picture they placed in it wasn't from their childhood, but a recent photo of them together at the barn, surrounded by the evidence of their father's love and their own commitment to healing. It was a portrait of a family rebuilt not despite tragedy, but because of one man's determination to ensure that love would outlast death and that justice would ultimately prevail. Robert Mitchell's final project had succeeded beyond his wildest hopes. He'd not only brought his children back to each other, but had given them the tools to build healthier lives and relationships. His murder had been solved, his killer brought to justice, and his family restored. In death, he'd accomplished what years of life had made impossible. He'd given his children the gift of coming home.